Welcome to this month's Developer Community Call. I'm Jeremy Thake. I'm a Principal Program Manager on the Microsoft Graph team here in Redmond. And today we have a great guest talking about the new announcement that we had last week on the Graph Toolkit. Just as a reminder, if you want to share this call with anyone, the aka.ms/Microsoft Graph call is the link to use to share this with colleagues and friends around the world that want to learn about Microsoft Graph. We do these calls on a monthly basis. They're at 8 a.m. PST time. Next month's call is the week of Ignite. And so rather than have Ignite and this call, and unfortunately a lot of us will be busy, we're actually going to skip next month, a little bit like we did with Build. It seems like our landing slot always hits the big conferences. But we will be continuing after Ignite with a December meeting on December 3rd. So make sure you have that in your calendar. So today I'll give you a few quick updates, and then I really wanted to give Nikola as much time as he needed in the hour to talk about the Microsoft Graph Toolkit. So just some updates. We have a new Microsoft Learn modules that we've started to ship as part of an upcoming Microsoft 365 certification for developers. So if you go to graph.microsoft.com to our developer center and you click on docs at the top here, we've always had tutorials on the left-hand side, and these are primarily to get you started with the graph. So no matter what kind of platform you're using, we give you a kind of a 0 to 60 from file new project all the way through to a running project in whatever IDE you're kind of familiar with across those languages. And Jason Johnson and our team has just recently shipped the React Native, React, and the .NET Core versions of this particular tutorial. But if you go over to the overview section in the scenario-based tutorials, we've had a change notifications and Delta query tutorial for a while. We get a lot of questions around change notifications and subscriptions and how often you need to subscribe and the mechanisms of subscribing for essentially webhooks. And so that tutorial we've had for a while. But these new ones here essentially allow you to follow through and work out how you can use query parameters in our API across the different workloads and services we have on Microsoft Graph. This is on the new Microsoft Learn platform, so you do get experience points for completing the modules. And the way they work is very similar to our existing tutorials of stepping through in a series of steps. But the benefit here is there's kind of quizzes as you go through, and there's a full video you can watch as well to basically make sure you've understood what you've gone through in that course. So there's some great things there with both on the query parameters, but also on network traffic. So we talk about throttling, which is quite a common thing that we have to handle in Stack Overflow and GitHub forums. So best to take those courses so you completely understand and grok what's going on there. And then I know I mentioned this last time, but just as another shout out, you will notice in our docs now, which I appreciate all the feedback we've been getting here, is if you scroll down for any GET HTTP request that we have now, when you click on the try it button, we'll actually run a new version of the Graph Explorer here directly in line with the documentation, so you can see those queries coming back. We're actually also working on the ability for you to sign in here so that if you wanted to test these queries against a developer tenant that maybe you got using the developer program, you'll be able to do that. If you're not familiar with what the developer program is, if you come back over to the graph, the programs are listed at the top here in the top navigation, and this is essentially where you can sign up. The main key benefit here is you get a developer subscription of Office 365, and as long as you keep using it, we'll keep renewing it. So rather than using your production tenants to test things in Graph Explorer and your own code, you can use those developer tenants. Now, in addition to that, as I mentioned, Ignite is coming. If you are already considering attending Ignite, we have a pre-day that myself, Vesa, and a few other engineers are putting together the content at the moment. It's going to be a great demonstration of what's possible with M365 in a day course where we'll walk through all the moving parts of a demo that we're currently building. So if you are attending Ignite, please check out that pre-day. If you've already registered, you can go back into your event registration and basically add that in as an option for your week at Ignite. It's on the Sunday before Ignite starts on the Monday. So that was that. And then if you aren't following along on our blogs, I would highly recommend you doing that. We do a lot of announcements on our blogs inside of Graph. So if you go over to resources on the top navigation and click on blogs, you can see here that this is where we announced the Microsoft Graph Toolkit is now generally available, which Nikola is going to talk about today. But something that we've had in our user voice backlog for a while now is the MIME format support for Outlook Mail inside of the Mail APIs inside of Microsoft Graph. And so we've just shipped all those things, and there's lots of documentations and samples there on how you get going with using the MIME types directly inside of your own applications. And we know that's a big thing for a lot of you. And so again, if you've got other things you would like to vote up, please go over to the user voice forums. We could really do with a more signal on what things are the most important, and we provide status updates by the individual program managers that are working on these things based on those votes. And some of these have got pretty low votes, and we know you're out there, and we know that you do need these things. And I'd really appreciate it personally, as I'm kind of driving this feature of trying to get the engineers to see that there is demand for things in each of the different areas on the graph. So I'd really appreciate it if you could go in there and take a look and see if there's anything that you'd need on the user voice. And this is just one example where we've listened to user voice and we've prioritized that work in this particular work stream. So with that, we've got one focus topic this week because I just think it needs an entire focus topic. It's really exciting to have Nikola on. If you listen to my podcast, or mine and Paul Schäferlein's podcast that we do weekly, Nikola was on Friday, which we published over the weekend. But there's nothing better than seeing this stuff live in a shared screen environment. So with that, Nikola, I'll hand it over to you to talk about the Microsoft Graph Toolkit.
Thanks, Jeremy. Hi, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. So a little background on the Microsoft Graph Toolkit. If you haven't been following the news for the past about 6 months or so, we announced the Graph Toolkit at Build this year as a preview, and it has been in preview since May of this year. And as Jeremy mentioned, we went general availability late last week. So now we have a version 1.0 out there, which is fully supported for developers to use. When we first went on to build the toolkit, we talked to developers to kind of decide what direction you're going to take this library. And few of the feedbacks we heard were that developers want to use reusable components regardless of what frameworks or environments they're running in. It's great that Microsoft provides reusable components, but they want to use these components everywhere. Whether they're using Angular, whether they're using Vue or React or whatever it is, these components to work. And additionally, when they want to use these components, they also want to make sure that components work with the Microsoft Graph, and the developers don't have to spend their time and figure out how to actually authenticate with Azure Active Directory get tokens just so they can get started and start calling into the Microsoft Graph. So we thought we'll try to go after those two problems and build a toolkit around solutions around that. And what we came up with is, and what I call it, is web components powered by Microsoft Graph. Now, when I talk to developers about this, I found that not everybody is familiar with web components. So I'm going to split this up into two different sections. So when I talk about web components, and when I talk to web developers, some developers think of web components as just any reusable components, whether it's React or Vue, or some developers just think it's just a JavaScript library that anybody can write and use. But in fact, when we say web components, we're referring to the web standard of web components, which allows you to write custom, reusable, and encapsulated HTML elements that anybody can load inside of their environment, regardless of what framework they're using. So for example, I can write a my element component that would act, for all intents and purposes, as a div or an anchor tag in your browser. And it will fully encapsulate JavaScript, CSS, and HTML code for a developer to use within their application. Now, the cool thing about this is because this is a web standard, it can be used with any JavaScript library or framework. It doesn't matter whether you're targeting React, Angular, Vue, or whatever future framework comes out later tomorrow or the day after. It could be Jeremy UI or Nikola UI, whatever it is. These components will work because they are natively rendered by the browser, and they're supported by all modern browsers. The only browser that doesn't natively support them is IE11 at this point, but there's also community performant polyfills out there that also make it available for IE11. So there's not really an excuse to not use web components at this point. And because this is a web standard, you don't have to have an external library to load this inside of your browser. It can be supported natively by your favorite browser, whether it's Chrome or Edge or Firefox, whatever it is, and will work with whatever framework you have. Now, once we figured out that we can actually build these web components and we can build them in a reusable and in a encapsulated way, we tackled the powered by the Microsoft Graph. How do we ensure that these components can actually work with the Microsoft Graph out of the box, make it easy for developers to get started with the Microsoft Graph? And what we did is we made sure that when we build these components, they automatically know how to talk to the Microsoft Graph APIs. For example, if you use the person component can fetch the person details for anybody that you want to query. For example, here I'm querying the current logged in user using the person query equals me. Or I can say person query equals Jeremy, and it will go to the Microsoft Graph and go figure out who Jeremy is that's most relevant to my account and fetch their details and display their details on the page. In order to support this, though, we wanted to make sure that these components work outside of just a demo environment. We wanted to make sure that these work in any environment that developer might want to use them in. So we, out of the box right now, with the version 1.0, we support running these components inside of any web applications on any browser or progressive web apps. We support SharePoint web parts, and we also support Microsoft Team tabs. So if you use these components inside of your web environment, inside of any of these environments, we have authentication providers that with 2 or less lines of codes will enable your components to work automatically. And finally, these components look and feel like they're part of the Microsoft 365 experience. We built these components based onto the Fabric style. So they look and feel like any other Microsoft 365 experience. But we also understand that developers might want to customize their components and style them to fit their brand. So they're also fully configurable and customizable any way you might want to kind of do that. And I'll show you this in a demo as well. So now that we've figured out how to build these components that can be used anywhere the developer will want when they're building their web applications, and we figured out how to actually enable them to work with the graph automatically. We created the preview, which developers started using and gave us feedback on. And that allowed us to get to a Vue 1.0 last week, which contains 7 different components and 4 authentication providers. On the component side, we have a login component, which allows you to authenticate and sign in users. We have a person components that can display a person from the graph, a person card that can display details for a person, a people component that can display a group of people that are most relevant to you or from a group. People picker allows you to search for people in your organization, whether they're in a group or global in your organization. Agenda control to list a list of events, and a task control to help you work with tasks that might be in Planner or Microsoft To Do. And these components wouldn't be possible without the authentication providers, which power the authentication and the token generation for the Microsoft Graph. And we provide MCell provider that uses MCell.js. We have a SharePoint provider that allows you to use SharePoint contacts, a Teams provider that enables authentication directly in the Teams tab, and a simple provider that allows you to use your existing authentication to power these components. We also have an iProvider interface, which all these providers are based on, which you can use to create your own providers and even contribute them back to the toolkit for other developers to use as well. Best thing to do is here to just do some demos for you. I could spend all day talking about these things, but it won't matter unless you actually see it in action. So I'm going to go ahead and start with showing you how to get started with this. So the first thing to do, if you're not familiar with the Microsoft Graph Toolkit, is to just go to aka.ms/mgt, or just Google or Bing Microsoft Graph Toolkit. It will take you directly to either the GitHub page or the docs page on docs.microsoft.com, which you can get there from here as well. And to get started, there's two ways to do this. You can either use our CDN, which is just a script tag that you add on your page. Zoom in. This is a script tag you add on your page, or you can use our npm package and just do npm install at Microsoft/mgt, and this will contain ES6 modules or ES5 CommonJS modules that you can use with your favorite parser or bundler or whatever you decide to use in your applications. Now, the easiest way for me to demo this is to using the script tag. So I'll be using that in my demos today, but everything I'm showing you today can be done both with the CDN and with the npm package. So first things first, here is a simple HTML page on the left side that I already added the script tag to. The same script tag I got from the GitHub page. And here I've added this logging component, MGT logging component. I haven't added any frameworks. This is just a one page. I am hosting it on a local server. I'm using an extension called Live Server that you can install on VS Code, and I'm hosting it on port 3000. You can see down here, it's running on port 3000. Just hosting this index.html page locally on my machine. So by default, when I add these two lines of code, you can see here on the right side in the browser, I have the sign in button. So automatically starts rendering this without me actually having to do anything. Now, it's not going to work because it doesn't know how to authenticate the user. So that's why we have these providers, which I'm going to uncomment here. In this case, I'm using the mcell provider directly as a component, and I'm simply passing a client ID that I've gotten from the Azure portal. You can use this mcell provider. We have a Teams provider or SharePoint provider, which I'll show you in a second. But just by giving it a provider on the page, the component will now automatically pick that up and will start listening to events from that provider and be able to send commands to that provider. So now when I click sign in, it will automatically know that, hey, I'm using mcell. I can go ahead and sign in. I'm already signed in and as Alex. It's in a different application, so I can pick that up and sign in inside of this application. So now with 3 lines of code, I have a fully authenticated user, which I can sign in, sign out, and I can view their detail, their profile picture, and everything. So for somebody that's trying to get started with the Microsoft Graph and starting to just play around with it, this is super easy to get started. Now, there's some cool things you can do here. For example, let's say I want to add another component in here. These components, as you add them on the page, they already know, because there's a provider on the page, how to use the provider. So for example, if I add a person component and I say I want to query the current logged in user by just passing me, as soon as I add that person, it will automatically add it on my page. If I zoom in here, you can see here added this, just the image of the user. Now I might want to show the name of the user, so I can do show name. I can also show the email of the user. And when I save, it will show the email and the name of the user automatically. So you can imagine using this component all around your applications when you just want to represent a person. And let's say you want to actually show more details about the person. We recently also introduced the person card component. So if I do person card and I say I want to show it on hover, you can also show it on click. You can control how the person card shows up. So when I hover on top of a person component, now I have this person card experience, which allows me to message or email, or if they have a phone number, call them using the default handlers. And I can expand and I can add more data in here as I see fit. So it's really easy to add these experiences into your application. And you notice there was only 1 line of code to be able to do this. Now, I talked about adding this, using this in multiple environments. And this is right now running in vanilla JavaScript, no framework, just a simple HTML page. But what if you want to use this in SharePoint using React and TypeScript? And I have a demo for that as well. This is just a regular web part that I went and created using their template generator. It's using React as the framework. It's also based on TypeScript. So as you can see here, the extension is TSX, which is the TypeScript variant of JSX. And to get the toolkit running in here, I've installed it as an npm package. So I've gone into just the command line and wrote npm install at Microsoft/mgt. It pulled down the package from npm and it made it available to me to use. So in order for me to use this inside of my web part, all I have to do is just make sure that my components can know how to use the SharePoint context. So here, for example, I've imported the providers and a SharePoint provider from the Microsoft Graph Toolkit, and I'm using the CommonJS library. And then once I've imported those namespaces, now when I initialize the provider, all I have to do is just create this global provider and set it to a new SharePoint provider where I pass in the context of this web part. And because this context allows me to talk to the Microsoft Graph, this provider already knows how to talk to the Microsoft Graph. And because I've set the global provider to my SharePoint provider, any component that I put on my page, on my web part, will now have a reference to this global provider and be able to call into the Microsoft Graph automatically. In fact, the AMCell provider you saw me use earlier is doing this exact same thing in code behind. Instead of SharePoint provider, it's using an AMCell provider and passing some parameters. So you can do the exact same thing that you saw me do earlier with the AMCell provider in code behind as well. So now that I have this here, when I go into my render function, I can start using the same components here as well. And when I go into my SharePoint workbench, and I can add this web part. And there it is. You can see here, it renders, it automatically knows how to talk to Microsoft Graph and display these details. And I can start adding more components here as well. So for example, if I want to add an agenda component, group everything by day and show up to 10 days. And then if I refresh here, this should automatically use that component as well and display that data. So it's very easy to add these components even in your SharePoint web parts. Now, it's worth noting that to get this to work inside of a web part, you also have to follow the guidance of using the Microsoft Graph inside of your web parts. So one thing I had to do as well is in the config file for my web part, I had to set the scopes that my components will be using. And an administrator does have to approve these scopes. And that is a requirement in order to use the Microsoft Graph inside of your SharePoint web parts. Additionally, I also upgraded the TypeScript compiler on this project to 3.3 because the Microsoft Graph Toolkit does require a 3.0 or plus TypeScript compiler. And to do that, you just install a new compiler using the rush-stack.compiler-3.x, and then in your tsconfig, you just make sure you extend that compiler as well, and your web part will be able to use that. Now, all this is documented in our docs page as well, if you want to go follow that, and it's really easy to do. Now, what about if you already have your own authentication in your own web application? You don't want to use the AMCell provider that we give you. Now, to do that, we can use the custom provider. So for example, here is, let's see, simple provider. Here is a single page app. This is the quick start getting started sample from the Azure portal when you create a new AMCell, when you create a new AAD application. And this is using the AMCell library to authenticate a user. And in order to use this component in this scenario where developers is already authenticating, they already written all the code they need to authenticate with AAD and to use the Microsoft Graph, these components still need to know how to talk to the Microsoft Graph. In that case, you can use what we call a simple provider. And here in this case, you simply set the global provider to a new simple provider, and the simple provider takes in a function that returns the token that a graph call might need. So essentially, every time a component might need to make a call to the Microsoft Graph, it will call this function asking for a token to talk to the Microsoft Graph. So while you still have your authentication, you've already written all the code, you can still use these components just by letting them know how to use the tokens from your authentication code that you've written. Great. So now that we've learned how to authenticate and how to use these components together with our authentication providers, what other components are there? So I already showed you 3 of them. I already showed you the login component, which allows you to authenticate and to sign in users. I showed you the person component, which can display a user, and also showed you the person card component, which we just announced, which displays the details for a user. In addition, we also have the people components. So if I do mgt people, this displays your most frequent contacts or people that you have in the Microsoft Graph. You can also do things such as group ID and display contacts or people inside of a group if you want to set the group directly in code or here as an attribute. We have a component to search from people directly from your organization. So for example, if I use the people picker component, this is going to render a people picker, and then I can start searching for people. Megan, for example. I can search for Rosie, and we've put a lot of effort into making sure that this component, for example, works with keyboard completely, so you don't have to use the mouse. You supports tabs and enters and escapes, and it just looks and feel as a people picker you would expect. In addition, we have 2 other components that we've created to fetch rich data. So for example, the MGT agenda component can get data from the calendar. For example, let's say I want to show multiple days here. By default, it shows 3. But if I want to say up to 60 days, for example, and this will show calendar events up to 60 days, and I want to group everything by day, you can do that. And then it shows you all these events there that way. And then finally, we have a task component that by default, it will go ahead and fetch all your planner tasks that you might have in Microsoft Planner. And you can do some cool things here as well. So if I expand this a bit. So I can, for example, I can add new task. Finish this demo. You can see I haven't removed my other task from my previous demo. And let's see, I completed one of them and we're done there. Or for example, I can show tasks from and play with tasks in To-Do. So if you're using the Microsoft To-Do application, this will go and use those tasks as well. And I can add and complete Microsoft To-Do tasks here as well. And demo here as well. And we can add this component, etc. And this also has options to limit it into a specific folder or a specific bucket in Planner, and you have full control over the header and how everything you want it to look like. Now, let's say you want to configure these components. You want to change the style of these components. Let's say I'm going to use the agenda component for this. And 30 days, I'm going to show up to 7 events. I'm going to group by day. Save that. Let's say I want to customize how this component actually renders colors, backgrounds, etc. So the best thing to do is actually use CSS to do this. And we've exposed several CSS classes, CSS properties that you can use. The best way to figure out what those are, if you just go to our documentation, so aka.ms/mgt or mgt docs also works. And you can, for example, go to the agenda component here. If you go down to CSS custom properties, you'll see all the properties that we've exposed to customize this event. So now that I have this on my page, I can use my CSS skills to do this. So I'm just gonna use the MGT agenda query selector. You can add a class or ID, you know the drill. And for example, let's say I want to change the color of the subject of each event. So I'm just going to copy this and let's make it pink. And now you can see here that customizes how the event renders and how the color changes. But let's say this is not enough for you. Let's say you want to completely change how the events render. You want to completely change everything. One of the best ways to do that is through templating. So for example, you can provide a template for how each event renders. So here in an agenda, I can say, hey, I want to retemplate each event. And now, because I haven't provided anything, nothing will show up. And let's say I want each event to just have a div, and then just to show the events, the subject. To do that, you can use binding. So I can do event.subject, and you do the binding with the double curly brackets, and you can automatically convert that path to the actual subject of the event. Now, let's say you don't know what is being passed to you in each template. Simple thing you can do, you can just pass in the event. It will render the entire JSON for you, and you can decide how you actually want to do these. It's actually pretty powerful, some of the things you can do here. So for example, let's say you want to iterate over several elements. Let's create a unsorted list, and I want to loop over all the attendees in events. So I'm going to use a data for. I'm going to say for attendee in event.attendees, I want to, let's say, attendee, and I don't know what attendee is, so it will just render their JSON. You can see here attendee has an email address field that has a name in it. So I can say, okay, attendee.email address, they'll render that object, and I just need the name, and I'll render just the name of whoever the attendee is of that. Now you can even go deeper than this. You can, for example, use an MGT person in here and say, I want to query this person. Because the event API only gives me the name and the email, I want to get more than that. I can just query this whole person by using their name or their email address, and that will get that person directly from the graph just by just passing their name or their email address. And then you can template this person and get access to that data and just make all those calls without actually having to write any JavaScript code at all to be able to kind of render this and customize how you want this to look. And then if you want to style this, you can just add classes here and then just style it in your CSS just like you normally would. It's really, really powerful. But you can also do more than this. Let's say you want to actually add additional data that doesn't come with the actual event API. Let's say you want to restyle how, let's say how you want to extend how the person card is using extensions. So let's say you want to use an extension inside of a person card. I have a quick sample that I built for this. So for example, here I have a person component that's using a person card on hover, right? I am retemplating just the person card, and I can provide my own template for the person card when I hover, what I want this to look like. For that, I am using a person card, and inside of the person card, I'm passing a template for additional details, meaning when the person card is rendered, I want to add additional details to that person card, and I'm passing it just an empty template, which is interesting here because you can actually get a reference to this template and use your own templating library or templating language or whatever you want to use to render additional details inside of this template. So you're not limited just by the templating support that we give you out of the box. You can actually use your own templating with this. And the way you actually make this happen is through using an event called template rendered. You can get a reference to the actual component, and every time a new template is rendered, you can get an event which passes in the data context and passes in the element that was just rendered. And then in here, you can actually make additional calls to the Microsoft Graph. And you might be wondering, how do I make additional calls to the graph? Do I need to actually set up my own authentication and again use a graph client, etc. But the good thing is through the Graph Toolkit, we actually give you access to the same client, API client that the Graph Toolkit is using that's already authenticated. So if you just want to make additional graph calls to the Microsoft Graph, you can just get a reference to the providers.global provider and then get the graph.client. And this is the same client as the SDK that you're probably using already in your applications. It's already documented. It's the official Graph client SDK. And then you can just make a call. In this case, for example, I'm making a call to all the extensions for a user that might have inside of Microsoft Graph. I'm getting that extension. And then once a template is rendered inside of the person card, then I simply just set the inner HTML of that template to whatever the extension name is. So in this case here, if I go to this sample page, so person card extensions.html, there it is. And when I open this, you can see here it actually adds this additional metadata, and I can style this however I want to, and allows me to extend this experience any way that I see fit, which is really, really powerful. And finally, one last thing that I want to show you in terms of templating is how you can actually use converters. So for example, if I want to add a converter in my data, if the data that's coming from the graph is not in the format that I need it, I can actually convert it. In this case, I have the notion of template converters. Here, for example, I have an agenda component, which is showing up to 60 days, up to 7 items, and it's using a template. And if I rendered this, if I actually comment out the template, you will see this just looks like a regular agenda that I showed you. Let's see here, agenda. Oh, this looks just like a regular agenda. But if I add this template that I've added in here, you can see here I can fully customize this experience however I see. And one of the cool things you see here that I'm using is a couple of features from templating. First, I'm using data if. Data if allows me to hide or show elements inside of my template by just evaluating this expression. So in this case, I'm checking to see if there is a location and it has a display name, then show the display name inside of my template. So in here, for example, I can show this if there is a location inside of my inside of this event. Another one is if, let's say, I want to join a Teams meeting and I want to check to see if the body preview includes this join Microsoft Teams meeting. You can see here I'm actually using actual JavaScript inside of the data if to evaluate. I'm checking to see if the body includes join Microsoft Teams meeting. Then I can do some interesting things inside of that template as well. And finally, let's say I want to actually convert data that's coming in and in a format that I want. So for example, dates. Let's say I just want to format the data that comes from the Graph API into something that I'm familiar, that I want my users to see. In that case, you can use converters. And the way you use converters is they're simply just functions. In this case here, I've gotten a reference to the agenda in my JavaScript, and I've added these converters to the property called template converters. So for example, when I set the template converters.day from date time, now in my template, I can use day from date time as a function to convert data from one to the other. So now here you can see I'm using the triple curly brackets. It's converting a start date time into the format that I want. Or I'm even passing a full event. Here I'm getting a time range from the actual event, and I'm converting it into an event. So it's really powerful, some of the things you can do with this and how you can actually extend the toolkit to make it look and feel the way that you want it to look like, and make it do what you want it to do. Now that's what I have for you today. Let me see if there's any questions.
Yeah, there was quite a few questions, Nikola, so I made a note, and if you don't mind, I'll just read them out to you and you can have a crack at answering them.
Awesome, let's do it.
So there was a lot of praise, so I think we'll start there because I know your team's been working really hard on this, but Brian Jackett, who is the one that led the 30 Days of Graph blog post series that we did last year, which is still going strong in terms of views. was saying that this is far more powerful, easy to use, and applicable to my customers than I originally thought. Hats off to the team. So there you go. We'll print that out and you can stick that on your office wall, Nikola.
Thank you, I appreciate that.
And then Minibach, Philippe, this looks really awesome. Ralph, that feature is lovely. Matt Sims, this is awesome. But the questions were, and I think you've answered them actually, but just to recap, Nilesh had asked, how can I set the size of the person card? So what would be the approach based on what you showed today if you wanted to kind of set the size of how big the card was?
Well, that's actually a great question. So right now the size is by default, I think 200 something pixels or whatever it is. If there is a property that we haven't exposed as part of a custom property, then we can easily expose that as an update, or anybody can contribute to it. I don't think we have exposed that property, but it's just a matter of going in there and saying, hey, we want developers to be able to customize this property as well. And we can create a width and a height property, a CSS custom property developers can use. I don't think we have that in there, but if that's something you want to do, either submit an issue on our GitHub or submit a PR for us to kind of add that in there.
Cool. And then Russell Grove asked, so you didn't need to give the SPFX app permission. So when you were showing the providers and embedding these things inside of SharePoint web parts, how, for instance, if you were using the calendar agenda control, what would be the flow for permission scopes in that attempt when you're using the SPFX provider client rather than instantiating your own?
So right now what I did is actually added all the permissions that my components might need inside of the package.solution.json. And that's how SPFX knows what permissions that this web part might need. And then as an administrator, I had to go in and approve those permissions for that web part to be able to use. And that's just a requirement of how web parts use the Microsoft Graph in SharePoint.
Yeah, that's awesome. And then Vincent Beret, who's been on this last month, so thank you for jumping on again, Vincent, and actually consuming rather than presenting. And can I use this provider to get the access token and use it with a Graph JavaScript SDK, the other way around? And you demoed this, but just to recap, like what's that allowed to do?
Yes, so we give you the reference to the JavaScript SDK out of the box. So I believe it's in here. You can call the providers.global provider, and which is the provider that you're using with the toolkit. And that has a graph.client a client property, which is just the SDK. And for those that are not familiar with the SDK, you can search for Microsoft Graph JS SDK. And the first result is the Microsoft Graph SDK, which has all the documentation on how you would use this SDK to call into the graph. And it's a very fluent API. You can see here I'm doing client.api me. I want to select an ID, I want to expand the extensions, etc. So it's very fluid to use for developers. If you want to get access to the actual token that's being used, you can also do that as well. There's a property, and I don't know off the top of my head, but it's providers.globalprovider. Get access token. It's actually a function, and you can either pass in scopes or whatever it is, and this will give you the token that the provider is using for all the graph calls, and you can use this token if you want to yourself and do whatever you need to do with that.
And so quickly, just as a follow-up there, when you set these things up, you're registering an application with a client ID at the top, and that's where you can predefine your scopes before you deploy this, right?
Correct. Yes, the client ID goes with the provider, which is what is requiring here in this case. And the scopes are actually defined by each of the components. The components know what scopes they might need. So when they go and use the MSL provider, they use incremental consent. So if the user hasn't approved, let's say, the calendar API, access to the calendar API, the provider would automatically pop up with the consent request to the user to approve that. So as a developer, when you're first starting with this, you don't really need to know what scopes you need. They will automatically get requested for the user. But if you do want to know what scopes are being used, we've documented that as well. So if you go to the graph scopes, you can see here the agenda component is using the calendars.read scope to be able to read the calendar.
That's awesome. And then Vincent's other question was, do the components expose events like on clicks? Now, I know you showed the rendering the template rendering listener, which is on the screen there on the left. But can you do things like intercept when things are clicked within the components as well?
So one of the best examples of that is the login component. For example, the login component has these login initiated, login completed, login failed, logout initiated, logout completed events. You can intercept and you can do your own things with it. So for example, if you don't have a provider, you just want to use it as a dumb component, you can fully control how you can see what buttons the user is clicking, etc. If you want to listen to random events into parts inside of the component, that's out of scope for the web component standards. So unfortunately, you can't do that. I mean, there's ways to go around it. You have to go reach inside of the shadow DOM. You have to actually know how that looks. But by default, we're not exposing that. But if you really want to do that, you can. If you look at how this is being rendered, for example, there's this shadow root here. You can actually get a reference to the shadow root and then query this shadow root DOM, and then you can actually get a reference to a specific element and listen to that. So there's ways around it. But if there is an event that you want us to expose much more easily, let's do that. Submit an issue and let us get that in there.
That's awesome. And then I guess that's the follow-up then is for those events, but also for data binding. And I know we've had this discussion with partners already, but in terms of data binding, like overriding the default data that is put into it.
Sorry, what do you mean?
So with regards to, say, passing in additional data on top of like the calendar information that's coming through, maybe you were doing some kind of merge of data from a secondary system that you wanted to render in these screens. Right. I mean, I know you've got open extensions here, but how would you additionally add that?
So the best way to do that right now is to listen to the template rendered event. These templates get rendered on demand, so they don't get rendered at the immediately. So we're saving performance there as well. But as a template is being rendered, you can listen to that, and then once the template is rendered, you can fetch additional data you might need, and then inject that inside of the template to be rendered as you wish. Does that answer the question?
I think so. Pascal was saying, or data binding for people picker, for example. But yeah, I guess you could do that too, right? Like adding additional information there as part of the rendering method.
Right. Actually, I would like to learn more about the use case there and what's the actual scenario. I would love to get that in there if it's something that we're not supporting right now. So whatever people are thinking of and that we're not doing right now, again, we're just getting started and we're thinking of everything. So I'd love to get that feedback and talk about what other things we can do.
Yeah, and so the best place to do that is in the GitHub issues for the repo, right, Nikola? Is that where you'd like to have those discussions flourish? Cool.
Right. If you go to, go ahead.
Sorry, so there's quite a few other questions. So I want to make sure we get through these in the call, if you don't mind. The other one was, do you have this similar example for files and folders in SharePoint?
So we don't have a component for files and folders right now. There is a browser React component that the SharePoint team is building, but I think we'll have to wait till Ignite to find out what more they're doing there as well.
Yeah, I know we're working close with those guys, so I'm hoping we'll have some good news at Ignite. We've been tinkering with it internally, so that will be a file browser for picking files almost. And rendering those files and leveraging the file previews. I think if there's any other requests, again, like as Nikola said, if you go to the Graph Toolkit GitHub repo, you can go to the issues page there and create new issues. And you've got a really nice set of notes on how to do feature requests versus raising issues in that page as well.
So you go to issues and then you click on new issue. You can follow bug reports or feature requests or questions, and we can easily get it done.
And then I love the fact that you have answers to all these questions. Pascal asked an additional question was, are there any plans to create a generic component to execute custom queries and use the templating to style it?
That's a good question. One of the things we've been looking at is adaptive cards and see if we can actually get adaptive cards as a component where they can render things from the graph as adaptive cards. But I haven't actually thought of using the templating to custom style a custom query. Well, that's actually a really interesting idea. I would love to get that as a feature request in the toolkit and talk more through it of how that will work. But now that I think about it, that sounds actually really cool.
And then Russell Grove asked, what other controls are on the roadmap?
We've played with the ideas of adding things like a full-on calendar, and I think something that we still want to do, and we're exploring to extend the agenda component to do things like day, week, month view, ability to add events and edit events, things like mail, being able to view your mail and be able to create and send email, or just trying to think through what else we have on my board. Things that work with teams, so be able to do channel pickers or team pickers, etc. So we don't really have a full-on roadmap right now for components. We've kind of built everything we wanted to do for 1.0, and we're hoping that developers will actually help us decide what components we want to build next. I think we're going to do with the calendar first, because I think that's something that I've heard many people request. But if there are components developers want us to build and prioritize, please do let us know. One of the best ways to ensure that this project continues and gets the support it needs, and we can continue working on it, is by just getting the feedback from developers and developers using it, and to help us make it better.
Yeah. And then it was one last one. Does the MGT-login allows to lock down a specific HTML or component?
I'm not sure what you mean by lockdown.
Yeah. So does it allows to, I don't know if Sadula is still in the call, so we might need to follow that one up offline on issues, because I'm not quite sure that question. I'm not sure
yeah, if you have any questions after the call, I'm always available on Twitter as well, and you just send me a private message or just tweet at me, and I'll be more than happy to help out as well there.
That's awesome. And there's lots of other ideas coming through, like team incoming call events with phone numbers and so forth. So yeah, if we can get those added as feature requests there, and provide a bit of justification on the use case of how you're going to use it, it will definitely help for us to prioritize our backlogs. Hi there. Who's that? I can't see who's speaking.
Yeah, hello. This is Devraj.
Oh, hi there.
Yeah, apart from this, can we have a provision to ask some developer questions in this forum, or apart from this topic?
Yeah, we're actually running out of time on this community call. So the best place to ask developer questions is actually over on the stackoverflow.com. We've just put in place a new triage process there, actually, where we're round robbing the questions to our program managers within the product group. And so we are on a desperate kind of beat to get the amount of answered questions or responded questions, and you can mark them as answered, a lot higher than we have in the past. I've got a few other things I wanted to recap at the end of this call. So if we can just focus the questions on the toolkit, and then additional questions, if you can focus that on Stack Overflow, and we'll do it that way for this call this week.
And I think, I'm looking at the questions right now. So it looks like, can we secure a specific page? I think you mean a redirect page. And the answer is absolutely yes. Because we're using MCell can be fully configurable even through the toolkit. So you can specify any properties you can in MCell.js here as well. So you can set your redirect page authority or whatever you want to do to configure MCell. And then I see a question on how to get the people pick people. The people picker has a property called selected people. So you can just get the reference to the people picker and just do .selected people, and that will give you an array of all the people that are selected in that control.
Awesome. Well, look, we're coming up to the hour, so thank you, Nikola, for sharing that today.
That was a pleasure.
I'm sharing my screen right now. I just wanted to just recap on a few things. I know we have a lot of people here that work in the community. Just as a recap, we do have an open source Microsoft Graph graph with all the graphics there. If you're running community groups and want some quick stickers from, whether it's Sticker Mule or whatever, wherever you can get stickers printed these days, this is what you can use to go get your artwork and use that across the different community things you're working on. In addition to that, as I mentioned, Nikola was on the show last week. If you want something for your commutes or your runs or cycling or other places where you listen to podcasts, please check out the M365 Dev podcast. And then as a quick reminder, we do have all these on demand on the Office Dev YouTube channel. And our next call will not be next month. It will be the month afterwards, December 3rd at 8 a.m. PST. We do read those questions, and I should probably update this slide because it is best in terms of technical questions that you go to Stack Overflow. So if I just show you what I mean by that, when you go to Stack Overflow publicly, just throw this over here, and if you just type in Microsoft Graph, you'll see there's lots of questions here, and you can see that we actually are on top of it a bit now because we have this system in place where we're round robbing them against different product group program managers. And so if you have questions, please make sure you just tag them with those. There are additional tags that we've started to add now, but if you can make sure you always have the Microsoft Graph one, but you might get to your PM quicker if you add like Microsoft Graph files, for instance. And we've started to add those additional tags to help farm those things through. So that's the best place for you to ask questions right now if you have any technical ones on that. And then outside of that, thank you very much. And hopefully we'll see some of you at Ignite. Please come over to the Microsoft Graph booth area and come say hi to us in person. You can bring your questions there in person and discuss that with us too. Again, a big thank you for Nikola for taking the time this morning to show the toolkit. And I cannot encourage enough that you provide your feedback on that toolkit and put your feature requests in there, because it's an understatement to say that Nikola and his team are hungry to go build the next set of web components for this. And you have the opportunity to influence and sway what they do next. So please engage with them on their GitHub repo, because it's going to be really important for us to make sure that we're heading in the right direction, and it's exactly what you folks need out there to build these things inside of your web applications. And also, just as a reminder, we have a Windows community toolkit, which Nikola used to lead and has jumped onto the web toolkit now, that allows you to build those same sorts of things if you're building Windows applications as well. So if you haven't checked out the Windows community toolkit, please check that out. There were some new announcements just recently with similar components that Nikola showed today for the Windows toolkit too. So with that, thank you for joining, and we'll see you again on this call in December.